We are trying to untangle the web of Protestant denominations in America, starting with the largest, its current size, when it was founded, and that's shown on a timeline with other denominations all listed here by size. And as you'll see in a moment, they are separating into groups. And these groups are not political. We are not choosing to focus on which churches hang which signs or where you'll find gay weddings or women preachers. You can Google that sort of thing. You could also, if you wanted to find out what the members really think, you could ask them. But our focus is not on who or what or why these denominations do what they do, but where they came from, which of course means medieval Europe. Let us pick up the story 5 centuries after the split between Catholicism and Orthodoxy with an Augustinian monk and his 3 solas, a break from Catholic unity. The Bible alone looks at apostolic authority and traditions and rejects them, moving away from ecumenical councils and towards private judgments. Faith alone turns its back on the deposit of doctrines and their corresponding duties. Faith no longer here is an intellectual assent, but just a happy confidence in one's individual salvation. Grace alone moves away from participation in a sacramental economy and towards an invisible, a confidential election. Next, a Frenchman shaped these breaks into a new theology called Reformed, memorable or made memorable through the acronym TULIP, but better identified with the novel concept of forensic justification, which I explain in a different video. A break here from historic Christian theology as summarized in the Counter-Reformation Council of Trent, and another group giving a radical interpretation to Luther's break from traditional authority. While Calvin ruled in Geneva as a theocratic tyrant, these Anabaptists did not feel like trading one set of imposed rules for another, which resulted, eventually, in decades of war and millions of deaths. But we're trying to focus on ideas, on the 16th century reimagining of the church shown graphically, Luther's moving away, partway at least, from authority, from doctrine, and from the sacraments, and Calvin's focus on his, quote, reformed theology, and the radical reformers being, well, radical. These guys didn't even think Christians should hold public office. He disagreed. Religious leaders ought to have power, and that leader, he thought, should be him. It's a less doctrinal, a different take on the Reformation. And we're trying to be polite. We're trying to focus not on crimes, but on ideas, like on how this Archbishop of Canterbury guided the Church of England towards Reformed theology, but not as drastically as this Scottish disciple of John Calvin, an elder or a presbyter of a denomination governed by a council of those kind of elders, and the first such council in America happened in Philadelphia. Followers of Luther, including many from Scandinavia, also made their way to Pennsylvania, as did the Amish. Hey, William Penn's religious toleration idea, that was no joke. But we back up the clock to find the Anglicans setting up shop in Jamestown, Virginia. This is over 100 years after the first Catholic missionaries came to the New World, but hey, better late than never. And it'd be best, perhaps, for you to change your name now after the Revolution. And if you were an Anglican pastor during the Revolution, that would have increased your likelihood of being a loyalist. You know, loyalty to the crown, because King George III is still technically the head of your church. Okay then, who are the patriots? These guys, these Puritans, definitely protested against the vestiges of Romanism in the Church of England. And they did so with a dour mix of legalism and reform theology that morphed into the first distinctively American expression of Christianity. And our chart is filling up. Hey, look, 3 different approaches to church government. Episcopos comes from the Greek for overseer, an unbroken chain of bishops with apostolic authority. Or government by the congregation. How democratic. Or a council of elders. You could call them priests. But that would bring up the issue of your view of what the Lord's Supper is, and that's a whole nother story. Here's another refugee from Anglicanism and our 4th John. He was not into sacraments. Conscience over rules. Freedom over authority. And that kind of thinking will get you kicked out of Massachusetts. 150 years later, another John, another approach. One here that embraces both Eucharistic adoration as well as subjective, emotional, divine experience. Could this be a new take on the whole Reformation thing? Not a rejection this time, but a pulling together, rather a pulling together of the best of the Anglican and the Baptist traditions. Oh no, I said the T word. In the next century, an offshoot of the Methodist holiness movement takes root in the American South. Talk about a personal experience, speaking in tongues. Goodness, we are a far way now from Westminster Abbey, but we are still firmly inside the world of Protestantism, so let us take a look around. Starting with these guys, we haven't said much about them because they are, well, different. They are outside of Trinitarian Christianity. The Lutherans are still going strong, and, fun fact, in 1999, they ended the Reformation. What? Well, they did sign, along with the Catholics, they signed the Joint Declaration on the Doctrine of Justification. But these Lutherans didn't. Why not? Well, it was because they had a more Reformed, a more Calvinist theology. And then there are the Presbyterians. We'll focus on these two. They have similar names, but they totally disagree on hot-button social issues. Can you guess which goes on which side? The Congregationalists have, for my money, the prettiest of all the Protestant churches. Their largest denomination is the UCC, and according to Wikipedia, it's a mainline Protestant denomination with roots in the Congregational, Calvinist, Lutheran, and Anabaptist traditions. So that doesn't really clear things up. And the Episcopalians are hanging in there. Numbers, of course, are misleading. Pretty much everyone on this chart, everyone except the Lutherans and the Anabaptists, broke off at some point from the Anglicans. These guys might not seem too important, but one of them came up with that pre-tribulation rapture idea that you've heard about. But mostly this category is just where I dumped the groups that I didn't fit anywhere else. Hey, the Quakers, wait! Don't they belong with the radical Anabaptists? No, the Quakers are pacifists, but they are also engaged in society. And you'll notice the word evangelical, which Wikipedia associates with the born-again experience. And that is connected with Methodism and Pentecostalism, but not every evangelical is necessarily a Methodist or a Pentecostal or an Episcopalian. So this web is not perfect. John Wesley was a passionate abolitionist, and Methodist churches have, with some exceptions, been strong advocates for civil rights, but their largest denomination is now breaking apart over LGBTQ and other issues. The largest Pentecostal denomination, the Assemblies of God, needs, no offense, some help with its website. It's just kind of busy and disorganized. One big debate for the Baptists is how excited they should be about Calvin's Reformed theology. General Baptists say not so much. Primitive Baptists are all in, and Southern Baptists, that largest denomination, they're still debating it. Oh, and remember how I said the Methodists were always against slavery? These guys, not so much. But if you're thinking of combining Calvin's theology with Baptist anti-authoritarianism, wouldn't that make you the most Protestant of all Protestants? Maybe, but just remember that those Pentecostal camp meetings could get pretty crazy. And then there's the Hutterites. They've been staying out of trouble since 1520. So let's table the discussion about who the best or who the most Protestant denomination is, because we see that even when you try to run from tradition, you still hold fast to the good and the true things you have received. You try to live them out, and you seek a community where that's possible, something visible, tangible, something coherent, something that makes sense, something built to last. So maybe this, after all, isn't just a story about things falling apart. Maybe it's also a story of mankind's response in the best way we know how to a God who calls a people to himself and who is still calling us together.